Hello, everyone. We'll give everybody just a minute or two to get started here, and then we'll give an introduction. Thanks. All right. Good afternoon or good morning if you're out on the West Coast. I'm Justin Cates. I'm the Director of Emergency Management and Communications for the City of Somerville, Massachusetts. And I'm also the first Vice President for IAM USA. And I'll let Emily introduce herself.
Yeah, good morning and good afternoon to everyone. So again, my name is Emily Marticello. I work in Nashua, New Hampshire as the Emergency Management Director. And I'm excited to be doing kind of part 2 of our Beyond HSEEP presentation, which we were fortunate enough to do in Savannah, and excited to have you all on. I'll kind of get us started here and just kind of give overview of what we're going to be talking about, and a little less rush than if you saw us in Savannah. So we're going to be talking about kind of the history of continuous improvement. We'll talk about in more detail some of the techniques that we really feel that we should be bringing in to emergency management that come from other industries around continuous improvement, and then the future. And as we get started, I kind of just want to frame this conversation with a question I'm going to pose to all of you, which is, in your mind, just answer this question: how many of you are utilizing HSEEP in your organization, and you're using it as a way to continuously improve and build your emergency management program? That's typically what we think of we're doing with HSEEP. We're exercising, we're iterating, we're training, we're getting better. But now think of this second part of this question here. How many of you in your organization have been to an incident or an event, or maybe even just a project, where you keep seeing the same problems over and over again? And so that's kind of my point, right? So is HSEEP working in the way that we all intended it to, or do we really need to look at bringing in some other concepts around continuous improvement that are best practices from other industries? And that's really what we're going to talk about today. One housekeeping thing is you can send questions to our moderator, and then we're going to work through those at the end. Or if you have questions, you can save them to the end, and we'll have time to answer questions. So kind of let's get into a little bit of this brief history of, how did we get to this point in time where we're at now? And, if we trace a lot of the things that we do in emergency management back to the military. So we're looking at post-World War II, they're doing these interviews and after actions. And then in the 1970s, the Army kind of like formally implemented it. There's the Center for Army Lessons Learned. I've got to work with them. They put out a lot of great projects and best practices for conducting after actions. And really, as we look at our military veterans transferring both into the private sector, but really into the government, as they retired and as they moved over to the government sector, the practice of after actions went with them. And that's really where we were getting into that mindset of doing after actions in emergency management and in the government as a whole. But the thing is that the after action format itself really, really falls short. And there's a lot of studies out there and a lot of research that's been conducted on the practice of doing after actions. And all in all, the the documents themselves, although well-intentioned, are not getting us to the point that we all started out for doing them, which was to lead to improvement. And so there's a lot of analysis on how we can be improving our continuous improvement so that we're really getting to the point of why we all started doing continuous improvement, was to make meaningful change and drive meaningful change. Turn it over
So
to Justin for some
since
trivia
we've talked a little bit about the background of HSEEP, one of the things that I wanted to do is throw some trivia in there, especially since in preparation for this presentation back in Savannah, we looked back at really how we ended up where we are today. Why are exercises, after action reports, and ultimately the HSEEP methodology sort of the sole thing that we find many organizations doing to try and improve their programs. So I want all of you, if you're thinking about this, try and figure out what was HSEEP before it was actually HSEEP. And if you have an idea, go ahead and throw it in the chat. If you went to Savannah and heard the actual answer, don't put it in. But I'd be interested to see what some of you that may have been in this world for quite a while know about the backgrounds and the origins of HSEEP. Next slide. So let's talk about some of this history. So many of you are familiar that emergency management, our predecessor, civil defense, very prominent after World War II. And you, if you've done any sort of look into civil defense and some of the activities that they were involved in, drills were a big component of civil defense activities. But what's interesting about those drills is that many of them were very performative in nature. In most cases, they were really meant to try and instill confidence in the population that the government knew what they were doing, that they had some sort of a game plan for an attack on the nation. But really what it came down to was there was not really any sort of methodology behind it. There was no drive towards improvement or outcomes after each of those exercises. They were more of a show, really, than anything. And there's a great book by Tracy Davis, Stages of Emergency. If you are interested in history, this kind of gives that background of these performative exercises that had started in the past. And those were known as emergency operations simulation training, was what the predecessor to exercises was called. And then as we moved into the 70s and into the 80s, there was this shift away from civil defense towards civil preparedness, emergency preparedness, and ultimately emergency management. And with that, we started seeing more professionalization of our work, and included in that was the addition of exercise programs in our emergency management agencies. Really, the first area where we saw some deliberate attempts to standardize the methodology of how exercises are conducted was done after 3 Mile Island, where there was additional work to put into place to ensure that jurisdictions that were near nuclear facilities had robust plans and responses to be able to deal with some sort of a similar type of incident. And FEMA's work to develop the Radiological Emergency Preparedness Program was sort of that first example of how we put into place a strong exercise program and methodology for our stakeholders. And then furthermore, FEMA created a program at the federal level that was meant to be adopted by state and locals, called the Hazardous Materials Exercise Evaluation Methodology. And this is really the first time, if you look through some of the guidance of this program, we start seeing some of the familiar terminology that you see in HSEEP today, things like exercise controllers and many of the common frameworks that we use to describe, the progressive methodology from moving from discussion-based exercises to operations-based exercises. And then really the final piece before we saw the implementation of HSEEP was some of the work that was done right before 9/11 to try and build out this nation's terrorism response capability, the domestic preparedness program that was sort of shared between Department of Defense and Department of Justice. they actually had an unreleased version of HSEEP called the Justice Exercise Evaluation Program, JEEP. And that was probably the last remaining predecessor to HSEEP before it was created. So now you've got some bar trivia, the next emergency management event you go to. Now you know where HSEEP came from and how we kind of got to the point where we are today. And I didn't see anybody in the chat say an answer, so I'm guessing this is all new trivia for them.
I apparently can only chat with you, so this is very unfortunate. But so the last person I want to keep talking to. But no, hopefully we can see if there was anything in the chat later. But so now that Justin's given us that bit of the bar trivia, and I think we're all here because we understood what HSEEP stood for, and that's why we're on this webinar. But just kind of some things I want to point out about HSEEP and some of the points we're going to make on how we can kind of enhance our continuous improvement is it's in itself, it has very much evolved. I mean, there used to be volumes and now we're down to a single guide, which was consolidated in 2013. And then we had the 2020 update. And in itself, HSEEP really points out that it's focused on exercises and not necessarily intended for post-incident reviews, as in real world incidents. I mean, it lays out how you might do evaluation, including data analysis and corrective action tracking. But, you know, I think the emphasis is really placed on the guidance in where you can see the planning for the exercise, the development, the conduct, but not so much on the importance of the post exercise improvement actions. And that's really, you know, where my passion's at. And Justin's going to kind of talk about this in terms of the other presentation that he gave about project management and HSEEP.
So in Grand Rapids, we did a presentation making the connection between project management and emergency management. And throughout that presentation, we talked quite a bit about HSEEP because HSEEP, if you look at sort of the project management body of knowledge, HSEEP could be considered a method to implement an exercise project. And it's, you know, it's a well-developed method that is there for people who are serving as a project manager to lead an exercise from start to finish. They can use the variety of artifacts that come along with HSEEP, including, you know, the various templates and resources that can be found on the prep toolkit. Those are all things that help that project manager get the final outcome, to deliver value to that jurisdiction or to that organization to make some meaningful improvement from an exercise. So if you're, you know, kind of looking into this whole project management concept, you'll see that HSEEP is one of many tools that we can leverage when it comes to continuous improvement. And ultimately, this is something that if we're leveraging HSEEP in the way that it was intended, we'll find that it does provide us with some really great outcomes in improving our programs. Next slide.
Yep.
The challenge, though, is really that in many cases, we're not really implementing HSEEP in the way that it was originally intended. You know, we're sort of pulling different pieces from it and implementing it in a way that maybe is the easiest way for our jurisdiction or our organization. And it's not being thought of from the perspective of a continuous improvement program. It's really just thought of as sort of an activity that we as emergency managers do because we're supposed to do it. We're supposed to run exercises, and we know that there's a tool out there to help us run exercises called HSEEP. And so we're just going to pull various templates that we like the most and, you know, and implement the meetings that we like the most. And then hopefully at the end of it, we end up having an objectives-based exercise for our organization, rather than thinking of it in the larger picture. How can we use HSEEP as one component of a larger continuous improvement program? And this diagram here really gives us a good indication of what some of the other activities that we might find in the emergency management space that are actually continuous improvement. So if you look over on the left, you'll see that, you know, exercises are certainly one form of a way to improve your emergency management program, and HSEEP specifically is that method to enable that to be done effectively. But we also have deliberate plan updates. When you're updating your emergency operations plan, when you're updating your hazard mitigation plan, that is continuous improvement. You're trying to make changes to improve things that have been learned in the previous iterations of that document. We also look at real life incidents or special events and the after action reports that are conducted after them. That's continuous improvement. And then also when we think about incident action planning, the iterations that take place as part of that planning P, that's all continuous improvement. We're trying to make changes that put us in a better position than we were during that last operational period. So if we think about all these things from the context of continuous improvement, we're doing a lot of this already, but we're not thinking of it from the standpoint of a continuous improvement program. Next slide is you, Emily.
Yeah, so I think this is the part that we really want to talk about, is that in emergency management, we're working in a system, and so we need to implement a continuous improvement program that functions using systems thinking. And the private sector is where I learned all about continuous improvement, and it's really taken off as far as it's great for, business, right? So in the private sector, we're really seeing the evolution and investment in evidence-based continuous improvement processes. Everything back from the late 1800s, when Frederick Taylor kind of invented management and scientific management and standard work, all the way, through to even now, we're talking about human-centered design. The Office of Personnel Management has a whole human-centered design team dedicated to helping the government continuously improve our processes so that us human beings can access them. So we're really seeing this investment across the private sector, but not so much in the government sector. I can give a few examples, but across different industries, we're really seeing people buy into the importance of continuous improvement. But I think what to me is the most interesting is the evolution and the point that in the private sector, continuous improvement in itself continuously improves. And I think that is something I would, like to see translate into the government sector and emergency management, where we're really investing in continuous improvement as a profession and looking at change managers and process improvement specialists. And I think we agree we want to go there. So there's different continuous improvement methodologies that are out there. The Plan, Do, Check, Act is one continuous improvement method that's up there. The other, which is typically used in like a lean, if you've ever heard of that methodology. And the other methodology below it, DMAIC, is more of a Six Sigma methodology. There's a lot of different ones out there, just like we have the HSEEP methodology. There's different ones that different industries find best aligned with their activities. I've used both. And there are actually already deliberate efforts to include these in emergency management. I'll talk about, EMAP and 1600 right here. So specifically in NFPA 1600, it talks about doing Plan, Do, Check, Act. So we're acknowledging as a profession, hey, we do want to incorporate this. We do want to do continuous improvement holistically at the system level, not just after an exercise, right? And then I just kind of want to read what is on EMAP page 1, okay? So it says on page 1 that EMAP is designed as a tool for continuous improvement as part of a voluntary accreditation process for emergency management programs. So this just to me says at the jurisdictional and institutional level, we as a group of emergency managers have already identified that continuous improvement should be the foundation for how we're executing our emergency management programs. And what Justin and I hope to do today is give us some of the tools and best practices so that we can really start kind of living out that value that we've put into our different guiding documents here. So if there's kind of 3 things that we want you to walk away from this presentation kind of understanding, is that our emergency management, we're operating in a complex system, and systems require different approaches to continuous improvement. These aren't one-offs. We're talking about a very interconnected set of processes and programs that we need to address holistically. And so we need to look at continuous improvement from that lens. The other thing, a big pet peeve of mine, we spend too much time, as in currently most of our time, collecting data on what is wrong or was wrong, and not enough time fixing the problems. And this comes down to another element of continuous improvement, which is change management. And then continuous improvement is not just about response. There are tools and techniques out there that will help us improve across our entire system, which includes mitigation, preparedness, recovery, our routine operations. We need to think about it not just after an incident or right before an incident, but through all of our phases of emergency management. And how we're going to go through this today is we're going to kind of talk about some smart practices that come from other industries, and some of my favorites and some of Justin's favorites that we can apply to continuous improvement. We're going to kind of take it in 3 sections. First, we're going to talk about collection and analysis. It's important, but you don't stop there. We're going to talk about reporting and knowledge management. And then finally, we're going to talk about why we're all doing continuous improvement, which is solution development and change management. And we'll talk about some of those smart practices in the sub bullets and go into some details about how those work. So,
and just to add on to that slide, all of these smart practices that we're going to talk about today come from a substantial body of knowledge in human factors, safety science, resilience engineering. These are other disciplines that have focused around ways to try and improve some of the issues that we encounter in our industries. And I think that's really what will be the benefit here, is we can take all of this knowledge that's already been gathered in these other sectors and really start to apply them in emergency management.
No, yeah, that's a great addition, Justin. Thank you. And so I think the key sum of where we're at so far in this presentation is really, we as a profession continue to invest massive amounts of time and resources towards after action reviews and reports, but most are leading to no real change. And what we're going to pose here is that we're really just thinking about failure the wrong way, and our intentions are good, and we can align them to get those results we want, which is real meaningful change.
So let's talk about the first smart practice that we think can be leveraged within our work. Blameless postmortems. This is a technique that's used extensively in the tech sector, and they stole a lot of this idea from the safety community, looking at significant incidents, also from the healthcare industry, which do a lot of work around just trying to fix problems rather than focusing on creating blame on people. We see today in emergency management, the common thing, the easiest thing that people implement is, they'll go after an exercise or after an incident with a hot wash and do, what were the 3 things that went well, the 3 things that went poorly. And what we recognize is that, these are really not, this is not leading us to system investment. We're really just writing reports and not really getting to the point where we're actually solving some of the problems. And the concept of blameless postmortems really focus around learning and inquiry, trying to figure out what actually went wrong from the perspective of the people who were involved, and also trying to figure out how we can get feedback from them on how to come up with solutions for these issues. They know best, because as they encounter that issue, that'll be something that they'll probably never do again, because they've recognized what point they made that mistake, and it might have been something that needed to be trained further on. There needed to be a procedure developed for it. So this is a concept that we think is something that can be really implemented within emergency management. Next slide. So first, we need to talk about blameless culture when it comes to this blameless postmortem concept. It's one of the foundational elements of those types of postmortems. There's a lot of commonality between the traditional AERs that we see in emergency management today and blameless postmortems, but this culture is really the big difference, which is, I think, very challenging for us in a very first responder or military derived workforce that we find in emergency management. And we find that most issues that are encountered during exercises or incidents or even just during day-to-day operations are not blameworthy. Maybe 2 to 5% are actually blameworthy, but yet we treat most of the things that go wrong within our organizations as blameworthy, and that's really incorrect. We have to recognize that systems are complex and that they cause problems, things fail just by the nature of the complexity of the system. And it's actually surprising that more things don't fail during our day-to-day operations or during a crisis. But if we look at blame, really, it's probably not going to actually fix the problem in the majority of cases. And then fear of punishment typically leads a lot of the causes and contributors to these issues to stay very, very quiet. And we don't see those issues being brought up so that we can actually learn something from them. And we also would have to say that there's probably an expectation that both management as well as our employees or volunteers or whoever you work with, they probably have the same common ground. They want to fix the problem. They don't want it to happen again. So blame typically creates a wedge there between those two actors. If we can look at systemic changes, those are typically more enduring and beneficial than blaming people. And really, we should focus our efforts on what happened rather than who did it. That's really the key point. Next slide. Now, blame is a challenging topic because we love it. We love to blame people because it feels good. Even when we recognize that most of these failures are not blameworthy, we still do it because we're wired for it. And the really kind of challenging thing for us as we approach this topic is that emergency managers, especially if we're talking about incidents or exercises, these are typically novel situations, fundamental surprises. These are things that we were not expecting. And it's really, really, really challenging to actually blame somebody for something that they would have never been able to see in advance, that they would have never expected could potentially happen to us. And there's even a school of thought out there that says that really blameless is impossible for humans, and that really instead we need to focus our efforts around accepting that blame is something that we're wired for and be blame aware in all of our efforts, whether it be in the Blameless Postmortem meetings that we do or in the reports that we write, or even as we develop solutions to some of these changes. But this is definitely a very big hurdle for us as humans to get over, is that blame is really built into the way that we operate. And even when we are not in an environment where we're blaming people specifically, blaming an organization or blaming the situation in general still is not productive. So we need to move past blame and work towards solutions. Next slide. So as part of this process, one of the things that we encounter are errors and biases in how we assess how a failure occurred in a system. And I'll kind of run through some of these here. The first one being the fundamental attribution error. Really, this is something that occurs when we look at somebody that had involvement in some sort of a failure, and we think about it from the perspective of why would they have done something like that? It must be them specifically that caused this issue. But really, if you step back and say, if somebody had the best available information, the best available training that they had, would a reasonable person have done something like that? So rather than focusing on a person's character, focus on the circumstances, the contributing factors that may have led to that failure situation. And the easy way to try and remove that error is to always assume positive intent when you encounter a failure in somebody who's been involved in it. Hindsight bias is a really another good one that we encounter frequently, especially when we're doing that post-incident analysis or post-exercise analysis. And the idea there is that we, as that outside observer, going through and looking at the whole timeline, we look at the whole situation and say, geez, how could this person have missed this? Like, why did they not clearly sense that something was going to happen here during this incident or this event? And ultimately, we have a lot more information at our hands. We're not in a stressful situation. And so really, that person probably had a much smaller selection of information to be able to make a decision than you do as that analyst after the fact. So we need to be careful of that as well. Outcome bias is when we look at really how bad the incident was or bad the exercise was in determining the quality of the decisions that were made. So if something was catastrophic, led to multiple deaths or injuries, we might look at the decision process there and say, geez, they really screwed up big time on some of the actions that they took. When really there may have been a much more minor incident where there may have been a much larger lapse in judgment because of training or education when it comes to the person's actions that they took in making a decision. So we need to be careful of that as well. Confirmation bias, I think this one's a familiar one to most people, is that as we go through that post-incident analysis, we may encounter pieces of information that seem to support pre-existing opinions or positions that we have. And so we need to be very careful not to, as we write that report or facilitate that meeting, try and center in on those pre-existing positions that we may have had. One of the ways that you can get around that is by having somebody serve as a devil's advocate. Go in and start to try and deliberately ask questions, even if it doesn't seem realistic, that counter those existing positions that you may have as an individual. And then negativity bias. We will typically, as we collect information about the incident or the exercise, we'll focus in around negative information versus those things that are neutral or positive, and focus a lot of our findings and our assessment on those very negative actions. And so it's always important for us to look at the positive things that happened as well as we're trying to improve our systems in the future. Next slide. Part of Blameless Culture really is founded in this concept of psychological safety. And this is something that really focuses in on the idea of getting people to be comfortable enough to share failures and recommend improvements without a concern of being having some discipline put on them in a workplace or shame because they said something that may not be correct. We want to create an environment in our organizations, but also in our teams, especially as we talk about incidents and exercises. We're involving people that are outside of our workplace. We want to make sure that we have a culture where people feel comfortable to bring these ideas up and share those failures so that we can learn from them. How do we do this, though? How do we build a psychological safety culture within our organization? Well, any time that we're looking at our work, we should think of it as a learning problem, not an execution problem. We should think about how we can gain more from learning about why something failed, rather than focusing on discipline on somebody who might have created that problem in the first place. And then we also need to recognize that we're humans. We have our own challenges when working in complex systems. We have to acknowledge our own fallibility, especially when we're in a position where we might be writing the postmortem or facilitating that meeting. And then I think the other thing is to ask lots of questions. And this is something I do in my practice, is constantly just trying to learn more about what's going on and gain more information. Even though they might seem like stupid questions, they're helping me to build a better mental model of the environment that I'm working in. So this is something that when people see me asking questions, then they're more willing to start asking questions of their own. So this is a great way to do this. And the private sector has put a lot of extra effort over the last few years on building strong psychological safety within their organizations, because they recognize that it helps to make their organization innovate greater. And if they're innovating more quickly, they're making more money. And that's something that the private sector is always trying to do. So this is a big thing to improve organizational performance. Next slide. So all failures are not created equal. And there's a great resource that is there on the right-hand side of the screen. And we'll share all these resources at the end of this. We've got a link for you. Failures are across the board when it comes to the value that they bring to an organization. So if we're talking about preventable failures in predictable operations, that's where we start to be concerned, because there could have been something that we could have done, whether it be additional training or developing a stronger plan or procedures that are very familiar with us. We should have known better to prevent that type of a situation from occurring. But then there are also cases where there are just unavoidable failures in complex systems. There was nothing that we were going to be able to do to have the foresight to recognize that that was a potential issue that was going to come up, or we may not have had the resources that were necessary to be able to fix that problem. And then even more challenging for us to wrap our heads around are, if we think about innovation and testing and sort of the design of new systems, failures are actually praiseworthy when you think about it, because ultimately we're trying to break things to get better. And if we're doing that in a controlled environment, that's something that actually is going to be important for us to move forward to. Again, and we've talked a little bit about this before, is that when we're looking at failure, we should always think about it from the perspective of, did the failure happen in an environment where the people that were involved in that failure did the best that they could do with the knowledge, the training that they had available. Always assume that they were doing the best that they could in order to deal with that circumstance. And always try and talk about failure from a positive light in your organization, because that helps to build some of that psychological safety as you move forward. The biggest thing that I think is important for us to recognize if we look at that spectrum is that emergency management is working in a lot of these spaces. We were working in environments that are uncertain, that we have very complex processes. We have a number of cases where failure is likely going to occur in our work. And so we have to be willing to accept it and figure out ways to get beyond it. Next slide.
So, Justin, you're talking about all this, and I'm like, oh, this all sounds great, but sometimes it is someone's fault. So what do you have to say about that? What do you have to say about how do we hold people accountable yet still, have this culture of improvement and blameworthiness?
So I think the important thing to remember is that when you point one finger, you have three pointing back at you. And it's important for us to recognize in a complex system, there's going to be many contributors to that failure. And that you as a manager or somebody who's leading a project, or maybe the incident commander of an incident, you may see somebody do something that was incorrect and it created a failure. But ultimately, were you in a position where you could have provided them further insight, provided them with further training? We all have a role that we can play, and sometimes we're constrained by the resources that we have available to us. But we all know that that's a common challenge that we encounter, so we should try and refrain from blame and focus on how we can make those improvements, whether it be getting more resources or making it more clear of what our expectations are. The bullet points on the slide here really give us a good overview of some of the things that you should consider when you are in that scenario where you're like, I'm going to blame that person for that. I mean, if you ask yourself these questions, were the expectations for the job clear, realistic, and documented? Were the mistakes of the incident a result of a lack of skill, good intentions, or honest effort? Have you shared feedback with that person, whether it be a volunteer or a staff member or a key stakeholder within your emergency management program about their performance and where there's been gaps? Or have you just kept that all on the inside and not told them ways that they can make improvements? And then have you considered all the other contributing factors? It's so easy for us to just focus on one thing that occurred, but if we look at some of the techniques that we'll talk about later, there's ways for us to identify that there's more than one root cause to a problem in the majority of cases. Now, the one thing I would say that is blameworthy is deliberate deviance. So when somebody has been trained on something, or there is a plan developed and they've read through it and they know, and they've deliberately gone outside of that realm and it resulted in a failure. That's where I think there needs to be a discussion about how you can make improvements on that. There's a a great body of work on a concept called just culture. And I think just culture helps us to make that balance between blame and sort of a free-for-all, where everything's great and everybody's doing whatever they want. Just culture really comes from the medical community when looking at failures that may have occurred in a surgery or something like that. And yes, there are consequences in some cases because of things that people have done that were deliberately deviant from what we have decided as an organization or as a society or whatever the case might be. So definitely something for us to consider.
All right, so now let's, we've talked about having the culture. Now, how does this actually work? So I kind of want to go over how do we actually conduct a blameless postmortem? And like we said, we have finally compiled all of our resources, and so we'll share that at the end. And I want to talk about how blameless postmortems are similar and dissimilar from after action reviews and reports. So what are some of the things, and these are kind of the steps, so we have another guide on how to do a blameless postmortem. Some of the things I want to talk about, the difference in a blameless postmortem from an after action review is the asynchronous nature in which we want to do these. So we really want to develop our report, our postmortem report, asynchronously. We want to provide a platform or a space where people can contribute, can add information, context, questions ahead of any sort of gathering of the folks who were involved with the meeting. And so this is going to be done as people have time and as they're contributing from wherever they're at. And the other difference in the blameless postmortem is there is a clear focus on inquiry and learning as the primary function to start out. We want to come to this with a place of not blame, but inquiry. What can we learn from what happened? What assumptions do I hold that I want to better understand? Are those correct, or what were other people experiencing in this incident? So we're going to separate the learning meeting from the action meeting, from the improvement meeting, and they kind of call that soak time. And we really do need time to think and digest and learn. And I think the other key difference in a postmortem is that it's shared widely. And I think that's a real difference from how we currently do things, which is we almost never get to share anything we do because we don't ever release it. And that's the difference. In a postmortem, it's open. It's anybody in the organization who wants to participate, because again, it's for learning. So we want everyone, even if you weren't involved in the incident or the grant or the preparedness month, whatever we're doing a postmortem on, you can still come and learn and ask questions and gain experience for yourself. And again, the intent, and I think the problem with how we've done things before is the point is to have a failure to learn from it, and that we want to be learning. And if we're learning, that means we're modifying our behaviors and our plans and our procedures based on experience. And that's how we get to the next point of the postmortem, which is to actually resolve those action items. And how we do this in a postmortem is we really focus on asking how and what questions. And that means we're not asking who. We're not saying, well, who did that? Whose choice was that? Who made that decision? We're looking at phrasing and facilitating and inquiring, asking people, hey, what are the facts? What can we learn about what happened? And then we can dig deeper into what are those, different factors that could be addressed to, improve this situation in the future. So when we're looking at what questions, that's where we're trying to put ourselves in the situation and understand what was going on, what were people seeing, perceiving, what was happening. And then we ask people, how questions. How were they thinking, processing, gathering? What were the assumptions that they were making? How did they get to those? And we're going to stay away from those who questions because we're not trying to drive blame. And there's a lot of good interview and facilitation techniques that are out there, from critical incident techniques to critical decision-making method. There's some other methods that I like to use. One of them is called appreciative inquiry, which is another field of inquiry, and the other one's motivational interviewing. Those both also focus on getting to, understand how the system contributed to whatever the result was, not how the person contributed to whatever the result was. And Klein's questions kind of give us a bunch of examples of inquiry that the facilitator, but anybody coming to a postmortem would want to try to phrase their different questions in this way to kind of contribute to this culture of learning. And I mentioned some of them in the previous slide, but the cueing questions help us walk in that person's shoes, or whoever's shoes we're trying to understand, what was going on when different decisions were made. So if you look at some of the cueing questions, what were you seeing? What were you focusing on? This one, I think, gets into kind of the systems thinking, which is, what were you expecting to happen? Because ultimately, when we're in a novel situation, our brains are going to go connect to whatever experience we can rationalize is occurring right now relative to what we've learned before, and that's what we're going to make our decisions on, basically our assumptions. In my previous job, we call them SWAG, or scientific wild ass guess. So, that's what we're, a lot of times basing our decisions off of. So we're trying to get to those factors and speak that unspoken kind of thought process that's going on, so we can understand what contributed to the outcome, and therefore what would contribute to a solution. And again, we're going to provide these all in the additional resources. But just like we talked about in some of the biases, it is so important to focus on what went right. Ultimately, where we had success, it could be because of good fortune or good luck, which is a lot of times what happens when when a plan pans out, or a plan that we came up with pans out. And we want to make sure when we're doing any sort of postmortem that we're clearly articulating what led to success, and how can we capture that and implement that in our future iterations of whatever we're doing. We're going to learn just as much from our successes as we are our failures, and it also helps balance out the conversation, so it doesn't seem like we're focusing only on the negative outcomes, but we also want to focus on the positive ones. Turn it back to Justin.
I think that in emergency management, I have heard the term root cause analysis become much more frequently used in the emergency manager's lexicon, at least in the last 10 years or so. That's good. I mean, that means that people are recognizing that we shouldn't focus on the symptoms. That means that we're thinking about what really was the key thing that could have led to this type of failure from occurring. But I think one of the things that we've not done a great job on in our work is thinking about how root cause really doesn't work in that complex system type of model. What ends up happening is that root cause really allows us to think about things in a linear perspective. It's called causal determinism. Basically, the idea is that everything that is a cause has an effect, and you just go down this entire timeline, and as simple as it seems, that one root cause led to this final issue. And that's not really how things work. What ends up happening is that you've got this grid and this sort of mesh network of all these different actions and contributors that took place, and throughout it, many opportunities for failure may have been passed over, and in some cases something failed, but in some cases something didn't fail and allowed you to continue on with this system for longer than maybe you had expected it would. So what we want to try and push is the concept that root causes are not really the solution when looking back at an incident to try and figure out what had occurred. Instead, we should look at contributing factors, and this allows us to stay away from constructing causes rather than finding them in the system. It helps us to stay away from blaming people, because now rather than one specific focal point, now we have the opportunity to look at other contributing factors that may have led to that failure. And now we're also not looking at just the most distal cause, the thing that's the furthest way back in that chain of failure events. Now we're looking at things that may have been the final straw that led to the failure to occur. So this is really why I think we've got to change what we look at when we're talking about root cause. Instead of focusing on root cause analysis as one root cause, think of it as there's many contributing factors out there that led to that specific failure. Next slide. So when we're looking at contributing factors, this is something that is sort of a new idea for many who are very familiar with root cause analysis, because they're familiar with using something like 5 whys as an example, where you say, okay, why did that happen? Okay, well, why did that happen? Okay, why did that happen? And just continue to work your way back. And I think that's a good resource for you as you go through and start trying to identify these contributing factors. But remember, we don't want that linear thinking. We want you to go down that rabbit hole and try and identify why that one specific contributing factor occurred, but then also look at some of the other things that may have occurred and try and work your way back on them as well. What we find is that people are willing to come to a conclusion pretty quickly when they find some sort of glaring failure and reason that something had created a failure. But they're very unwilling to go down that route of trying to identify some of the other, maybe more minor things that occurred during that failure of a system, during an incident or an exercise, or even just day-to-day operations. You're working on a mitigation project, and there was some sort of an issue that led to the inability to get grant funding for a project. Well, why did that happen? Okay, well, it may have been people were not familiar with the deadlines and the grant application, but it also may have been that the grant application was too complex and that we need to revise the questions to make it more simple and intuitive for people. So contributing factors, I think, is the way for us to go, because it's not just a single node, it's coming from multiple nodes in the majority of cases. And there's a good example out there, if you're familiar in the safety sciences world, and you may have seen it during COVID, the Swiss cheese model. And you look at a piece of Swiss cheese and you stack up a bunch of pieces of Swiss cheese. And we use it in the COVID environment to say, okay, well, you can have a number of different barriers and mitigations to try and prevent COVID from getting to one point to another. But eventually, there will be one strain that will go through all of those holes because they've just lined up in the perfect way. But in the majority of cases, we have mitigations in place to try and prevent multiple chains of failure. But again, that's not going to be the case every single time. And in some cases, the things are just going to line up, and that's going to contribute to a major failure. Next slide. So there are some techniques that are out there that we can use that are sort of better than the traditional root cause analysis 5 whys style method. The first one is called the fishbone diagram. And what this allows you to do is to go down a number of different contributors to a project's success, materials, methods and processes, manpower, or staffing, or people, the machines or equipment or technologies that are involved, looking at the environment or natural systems. And what you can do is you go down each one of those categories to understand, okay, there was a failure that occurred here. What were the contributing factors from that category that led to that failure? And it gives you a more holistic picture rather than just one single thing. What are all of the different categories of things that may have led to that failure situation? The love bug diagram is basically the fishbone diagram, but it adds sort of an inverse version of the fishbone focused around mitigations. And so if we look at all the reasons why something failed, we can also now look at all the reasons why it didn't fail, or why it maybe didn't fail as quickly as it could have. So we identify within each of those categories, what are the mitigation measures that we put in place to prevent that failure from occurring? And then the other one that is definitely popular in the safety sciences world are causal or fault tree diagrams. And the idea there is using a sort of a logic model. We can work through a situation to understand various events that occurred, why they occurred, what they led to, and also start to map out how these different things interact with each other in an environment. Emily, I know you work frequently or had worked frequently with some of these models. Are there any best practices that you have on this?
Well, I think to your point is it's really not a one size fits all, and there's a lot of different tools out there. I am a big fan of the fishbone diagram. I usually replace the boxes with Poeti, so we're using kind of more terms that are more relevant in emergency management. One of the
For those
templates
of
we
you that
have.
aren't familiar with Poeti, that's planning, organization, exercises, training, and equipment. It's part of the sort of the DHS preparedness cycle doctrine.
Yeah, so one of the resources we have is the template of the fishbone diagram using that. And again, I think these are one of the other important things is I think looking at when we're doing these different types of postmortems, using tools that give us a visual. Because I think to our point here, in a system, if you're writing everything in a very linear report, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, that's not true. It all happened at once. And by using some of these other tools, we can visually represent, kind of this convergence of all these different contributing factors and how that ultimately led to whatever the outcome was. So I would encourage people to play around with the different ones that are out there. And I do think they give us a better representation of what it is we're trying to capture when we're looking to do improvement.
Yeah, I think you talked about sort of having it as a visual, and that's the reason why visual management is such a strong tool that can be utilized in organizations. And so this is just an example of us leveraging that for the review of failures within our organizations. Next slide. So the least effort to remediate. Okay, so we talked about distal causes. A lot of times you'll work your way back to what many call the root cause of some sort of a situation. And what we will do is we'll ignore sort of the final straw that led to the failure, the trigger point. Now, during some sort of incident, obviously, we're trying to do whatever needs to be done to try and stop the bleeding, to stop the fire, whatever the case might be, the lowest hanging fruit. We want to try and revert that if we can to try and at least create some stability in whatever we're working on. But we cannot let this most proximate cause serve as sort of the focus point of our analysis after the fact. And so often we'll look to this, the straw that broke the camel's back as the focus point of our analysis after the fact, when really there were many other contributing factors that occurred. So just be aware that this is something that we need to be concerned about when doing our analysis. So we always hear the mantra in emergency management: if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. Well, guess what? We don't do a very good job at that. Everybody says, oh yeah, we document everything. Not really. We don't do a very good job at that. And this actually creates some big challenges for us in the work around post-incident analysis or analyzing exercises or just general continuous improvement. One of the things that we find in the sectors that are very successful in using these techniques, particularly in the IT sector, is they have a lot of logs and data that are constantly being collected on their systems. A server fails, or a network hub fails, or a device fails. This is all being logged, and all the actions and activities that took place. They can pull a report on this at the end easily to identify timelines and all of this stuff. Well, we don't really have that in emergency management unless we're documenting things, unless we're tracking some of these key decisions that are made or key actions that take place, disagreements, agreements, all those things that are really necessary for us to report on. And we know that during an incident specifically, or during an exercise, the whole push is everybody should have their ICS 214, on a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. And a lot of times, it's inconsistent. The people that are taking notes on that are not really logging all of the necessary items, because it becomes toil. It becomes extra work that really people don't want to do, or it's cumbersome. They don't want to carry around this 8.5 by 11, and so then they'll start collecting it in a journal that they have. They can fit into their pocket. Well, now they got to go and transcribe that to another document that can be shared with somebody else, and we never end up getting the reports. So one of the things that we need to think a little differently about as a profession is, how can we make it easier for people to log these types of decisions and activities that are taking place, so we can do a better job in that analysis aspect of our incident. And I think that there's some really interesting ideas around using tools like Slack or Microsoft Teams. You have the ability to actually send messages to yourself, and now every message that you send to yourself is timestamped, and those chat logs can be exported easily, and that's on your mobile device. I would guess that everybody's going to have their mobile device. Now, certainly, the thing you have to consider is connectivity. In a disaster, that may not be a possibility, and you may have to revert back to the notepad. But for the majority of the instances, we do probably have access to that tool, and that would make that post-incident analysis much more intuitive and easier for the analyst to be able to go back and look at all the different activities that took place during that incident or that exercise, and what may have contributed to some of these failures. People are so reliant on their memory, and I can absolutely assure you that the way that they look back at something when they're being interviewed is going to be completely different than the way they may have wrote it down in the middle of the incident. And that's why, I use the quote here, the faintest pencil is better than the sharpest memory. It really provides a realistic perspective, especially if we're trying to figure out why somebody was thinking a certain way or what they expected to happen. They're literally writing it right then and there. They're not going back with that sort of hindsight bias and looking back and saying, okay, well, geez, I should have recognized that was the wrong thing to do. Well, you probably shouldn't have recognized it. You didn't have all the information. You didn't have the full mental model. So definitely something for us to consider is how we can make documentation a much easier part of our process, because we don't have the same benefits that the IT sectors do on post-incident analysis. So there, as Emily had mentioned, in sort of the sequence of events that take place during a blameless postmortem, one of the first things that we're trying to do is actually create a written postmortem. And this is sort of different than I think we do things in the traditional model of after action reports, where a lot of times they see a lot of the after action meetings as a core moment to gather information and to gather timelines and things like that. And that's not really a good evidence-based approach. Really, you should be doing most of that work up front individually with people, and that prevents some of the groupthink and all the other nonsense that we see during after action meetings. So what you want to try and do is actually have a written postmortem that's available for people to review prior to going into that postmortem meeting, which again is focused around learning, not focused around trying to collect all this information or anything like that. We want to try and have that as a moment for people to share their experiences, share why they think certain things worked a certain way. That's really where you're going to start getting some real benefits out of this. So what we want to try and do is we want to use some sort of an iterative and collaborative process to collect the information for this postmortem. What we see successful organizations do is they'll create a shared Google Doc or a Microsoft 365 Word document where everybody who's involved from that organization has access to it to be able to start adding their information about what happened during that incident or what happened during that specific project. And that allows you to do it asynchronously, because now people at their own time and their own availability can go in and add useful context and useful information. And you, if you've been deemed the person who's running this process, you can add in all of your information about the interviews that you've done or the analysis of documentation or logs that you've come across. all that stuff can be, added and contributed to that written document. One of the things that we want to enable, though, and we can do that with these collaborative documents, is making anonymous feedback possible. And the reason for this is, while we talk about how important psychological safety is and blameless culture, guess what? It's not something we're going to do tomorrow. Like that, we have a long ways to be able to get people to feel safe about presenting failures and their perspectives on potential solutions during a failure. So in that point between us having the perfect world and now, we need to have that ability for people to provide anonymous feedback so that we can really get the facts and still not have an environment where people are afraid to share and speak up. The other thing that we want to do is whatever tool we use, we want to make sure that it's searchable and that it's something we can use within our data analysis to do trend or theme analysis. So if we have multiple incidents of a similar nature, we would want to be able to look and use that data for the collection of trends, see what similar things continue to happen over and over and over again. And if we do it in a way that is like a PDF or something like that, that we can't pull that data out of it, it's going to make it very challenging for those analysts to do that type of trend analysis in the future. Write them well. I know that we're a lot of times trying to rush to create these after action reports, and by doing that, some of the things are left out or not included in the document. We want to make sure that they're written from the perspective that somebody can understand what we're talking about. And then the big thing that's different from our traditional after action approach is that we want to separate the what happened from the how to fix it aspect of the report, as well as the meetings that we come together for. This is important for us to try and prevent this situation where people start trying to interject solutions to things in the middle of us really even understanding what happened in the first place. This also helps us to really organize that first activity in the first section of the document around learning, and then having a separate area where we can talk about the corrective actions and the things that we're going to have as action items to resolve in the future. And again, I think this is a sort of a smart practice in any work that we're doing, not just post-incident analysis, but we want to send out the draft in advance of the meeting. We want people to have the time to read it, to understand it, because they're going to come to that meeting much more educated and perhaps even with other questions that they can then ask. Whereas if we try and do it all in the middle of the meeting, it's not going to be as fruitful as we had hoped. And we do have a template for this this outline in the resources that we're going to provide at the end of this. Next slide.
Yeah.
All right, so oh, go ahead.
That's me, and yeah, and so as Justin was saying, where we write the report or we write the draft of the report, and then we're moving into kind of the postmortem meeting. And again, like we talked about the differences from an after action report, the postmortem meeting is different than a hot wash. And again, one of the prime reasons is we've done a lot of the collection ahead of the time. We're getting people thinking, we're getting people in this mindset of we are going to both do inquiry for the point of learning, and we're going to have a separate meeting about kind of the action items. So again, some of the key differences, just like the written postmortem, is anyone in the organization can participate. And obviously there are some risks to that, which we'll talk about. But again, if the point is to create this blameless culture, then we aren't afraid of everybody coming to learn at our meeting. And it's really important that all of those who are involved in whatever we're covering are inviting and attending the meeting. The point of the meeting is not to read through the written postmortem, but it's again to gain clarity and context, to gain understanding. What another key tenet of continuous improvement, we've talked about a bunch of them, change management, but another one is knowledge management, and specifically knowledge transfer, which is the act of learning, sometimes from experience, but a lot of times from other people's experience. And in emergency management right now, we are having a huge turnover and a huge brain drain of all of our very knowledgeable and experienced and senior emergency managers, and we're rolling over into kind of the new wave of emergency managers, and some of which, you know, have a limited experience to almost just, you know, almost like just COVID. So if we're having incidents and we're including everyone in our organization, that means the most experienced person and the most inexperienced person are able to do that kind of knowledge transfer and, again, learn from these failures. But just like any hot wash, a postmortem meeting has the same risks, right? That and some of the reasons we all dread going to a hot wash is to listen to somebody's war stories, or you know, one person talk the whole time, or somebody focus on some little tiny thing that's really important to them and they won't let it go, or nobody says anything because, you know what, everything went great, and if we don't say anything went wrong, then it didn't. And the key here is having an expert facilitator. And, you know, this is another thing that I think the private sector does really well, is they don't try to be everything to their organization. They realize when they need to bring in others who can help facilitate whatever it is they're trying to do. That's why there's this whole profession of continuous improvement practitioners, change managers, process improvement specialists who do this, who are experts in facilitation. But it's also a skill that anybody can learn, anybody in emergency management can learn. And again, the key thing here with the postmortem meeting is we're separating the learning session from the action session, where we start tackling those items that are in the postmortem report that are items we're trying to mitigate. And that's because our brains need time to digest, to make connections, and to really think about, hey, these were all the contributing factors. Let my brain noodle on that so that I can really understand what are going to be the best solutions we need to put in place. And again, that really is the point of this whole thing. Yeah, we need to learn. But if we learn something and then we don't do anything about it, we actually didn't learn anything. So we need to make sure that we're writing really good action items in our postmortem. Or if you're even if you're just doing a regular after action and you're going to stick with that, this is the key part here. We need to make smart objectives, right? In the same way, we need to make smart action items. They need to be actionable, they need to be specific, and they need to be, you know, bounded in some sort of time. We have to have an owner for each item, even if it's assigned to someone to find the person who needs to put this item into place. And that's just like so important. And when we talk about action items, if an action item doesn't create or generate a result, then what is the point? It's this whole like this theater of continuous improvement. It's just like a show, but we're not actually getting anywhere. And what I would say to that is we need to consider using terms in risk management when we're creating our action items, because what I think we can all realize is we can't actually implement all of the solutions that are needed for a lot of the contributing factors to a problem. And I think I was thinking about this in the terms of, you know, the cost. We can't always put in place every solution we want that will totally, in our brains, solve the problem and prevent it from happening again. I mean, we only have so much time, money, staff, resources, statutory authority, whatever it might be. So when we're creating our action items, sometimes part of what we're doing is acknowledging or accepting or transferring whatever the risk is. We might be saying, you know, this is what is going to get done, and this is what's still going to exist for contributing factors or potential failures. And we need to consider, you know, are we actually doing band-aids, or sometimes I like to call them workarounds, right? We're fixing those, as Justin said, proximal causes, the things we can see, we can grab onto, the straw that broke the camel's back, those little things, or are we actually making those strategic improvements across our entire system? And the thing to watch out for is if we're doing a lot of workarounds, a lot of band-aids, we're accumulating this technical debt, which is something that I think all of our infrastructure has accumulated over the years, that we might fix the pothole every time it appears on the bridge, but we never went through and actually fixed the rebar in the system, and then it crumbles, right? So we've accumulated all this debt by not really addressing all of the issues that we're seeing, and we're just looking at the one that's like right in front of us. So, you know, a post-mortem without any action is it's nothing. It's, you know, it's indistinguishable from just moving on. and sometimes, you know, I wish people would just be like, well, we don't have time, we're just going to move on, versus investing in getting halfway there but never actually taking action. And again, if action items are never followed up on or never closed out, you're just you know, complicit in saying, okay, it's acceptable for that to happen again. And by doing that, we'll never get to this culture of continuous improvement. There has to be follow through. There has to be an iterative nature to what we're doing. So some of those things.
The one thing there is,
yeah, go ahead, Justin.
I think if you're leveraging those risk management concepts of how to deal with risks, and people, especially if you've got a culture where people feel that it's okay to share the results of this process, it's okay for people to attend these meetings and learn, at least people are now aware of where there could be failures in the future. And I think that's often one of the biggest challenges, is that everybody has a mental model of how something works, and everybody's mental model is different. And many of our colleagues are just not aware of how likely something is to fail, or how complex something is, and how challenging it is to get from step A through step B. I think that's the benefit of looking at it from that mindset, is that we can say, look, we're going to clearly announce that we're accepting this risk, and this is what could happen. And then that allows those who are in roles to be able to try and mitigate or respond to those types of issues. Now they're at least familiar with them, and they can think about how they might deal with those when they come up.
No, I think that's kind of it's on the slide as well, right? What makes it successful is sharing that knowledge, right? Doing that knowledge transfer, you know, letting people see, you know, for themselves, hey, this is what, you know, what happened in this project or incident. I think some of the key things that make it successful, again, are treating errors as opportunities to learn. And in kind of the continuous improvement field, there is kind of like this mantra that says mistakes are expected, they're inspected, and they're respected. And, you know, if we pretend that we're not going to make a mistake, we're not going to fail, then that's all we're doing. We're just pretending. But if we bring ourselves here into reality and we go, failure and mistakes will occur in a complex system, we expect them, and we have a process in place from which we learn from them, we inspect them, and then we respect that everybody is a human being and is part of contributing to the solutions to, you know, address what mistakes and errors are going to occur. So continuous improvement is not about fixing things when surprises happen. And I think that's the big difference that I've seen from continuous improvement being applied in the private sector and other sectors versus in emergency management. We are really using it as in response to something versus in preparation for something. And that's where we need to get away from that. And we need to look at doing continuous improvement consistently, not just after something happens. So there's a way to do that, and it's a thing called a pre-mortem. And I think these are kind of fun. And I think if you're looking at, hey, how could I possibly take any of these concepts that Justin and I have talked about today and take them to my culture, which is maybe the polar opposite of what we've been discussing, this is a great way to start. And it really talks in hypotheticals. And we're talking about, you know, using what they call perspective hindsight. So if we're looking at a pre-mortem and we're going to gather a group of people together, and because we do continuous improvement, throughout all phases of emergency management. My example here is we are applying for a big mitigation grant. So I'm going to gather everybody that's part of the team, and I'm going to say, okay, we just got news that we did not get the mitigation grant. Everyone, I want everyone to go around. I want to tell me all the things that we failed at. Tell me all the reasons we did not get this grant. And, you know, and we're going to put everybody in that place, say, okay, first of all, failures happen. And the first thing we're going to try to do is come together as a group and learn from them. But also, we're free to learn from it because it's a pretend failure, right? We're bringing everybody together and we're saying, let's pretend this happened and let's work backwards. Let's understand what could possibly lead to these failures. And that's going to do a lot of things for the culture, but it's also going to put us more in this preparedness mindset or this mitigation mindset really, where we're trying to get ahead of things and put in place any sort of solutions we can to address whatever contributing factors we might have imagined. But again, that talking about things openly, about just starting a conversation, you know, I don't know if people can imagine this in their organization, just start a conversation with, and we failed, you know, and I think that would be a big shock to some people, but by doing it in this kind of safe, pretend hypothetical, you're easing people into that culture. And I think that can be very powerful. And again, create that real knowledge transfer and information sharing that we're trying to do so that we actually can get the grant. Okay, the other thing to think about is if we're using any sort of project management or any sort of tool to iteratively build or design something, we might be working in kind of a sprint framework, which just means you're chunking out whatever you're doing. That's how I would summarize it. You're chunking things out into phases or stages or whatever you want to call it. And the difference, though, in this deliberative process, they use it in an agile process or in what's called like Scrum project management, is you have these short periods of time when a group is working on a project. In response, we would probably call them the operational period, right? So, but you would do them in anything. If you're doing a grant application, you've got like the pre-grant application, you've got these different stages in whatever project you're doing. And those are your stages of your sprints. But the difference is in a sprint, just like you have a mandatory quarterly budget meeting after each sprint, in every single sprint, you have a mandatory retro where you plan from the very beginning that at each toll gate along our project, each point in our sprint, we are going to stop and we're going to conduct a retrospective, postmortem, whatever, of what we did and what we can learn about it. And so in that way, continuous improvement is baked into the process. It's not something we do in addition to our work. So kind of here's an example of sprints, and you see this a lot. It started kind of like in technology development, but it's really grown to any sort of kind of project development or project management, or if you're building a new product, a plan, whatever it might be, doing it iteratively. But I think the point here, and the point that Justin and I want to make, is if you are baking continuous improvement, these retrospectives into your everyday work, that's how we're getting to that culture where this is normal. It would be abnormal if we didn't do it. What our normal way of doing things is we stop, we learn from it, we don't do it again in the same way. The next time we make a different mistake, or we build on that mistake and we learn from it.
And just like HSEEP, as I mentioned, HSEEP is a method in the project management world. It's a way to do a certain type of project. And there are other methodologies out there, Scrum being one of them, that allow you to have some sort of a framework to be able to work through projects. And that's, I think, what's important for you to know is that, there are other things that are out there that you should be thinking about depending on the type of project you're working on, whether it be a construction project for a mitigation grant, a recovery grant, or if it's something that you're focused around from the perspective of a plan, or you're buying a piece of equipment for your responders, whatever it might be. So let's shift gears now and talk about another smart practice. this is so frustrating. It really is probably one of the most frustrating things as a profession is that, you know, we are solving a lot of problems. Emergency managers are good at solving problems, but they're solving a lot of similar problems in silos, and they're not sharing those lessons with their colleagues. And if they are sharing, it's in a very, you know, small setting. It's not really transferring that knowledge to the extent that we could. And what's even more concerning is that, you know, we're not sharing what we learned from that experience. You know, it would be great if we were just sharing what happened, at least so we know that there's other examples of this occurring out there, but we're not sharing what actual things were learned from these mistakes or failures that occurred in other parts of the country. So definitely an opportunity for us to make some improvements. Next slide. So knowledge management is definitely an area that the private sector, many other industries, including government, have really worked to try and improve over the years, and something that we can definitely do a better job of in emergency management. When we think of after action reports, we know that they are frequently not seen as resources for the entire emergency management enterprise, but instead are frequently closely held. And that might be due to political forces or market forces. If we're thinking about the private sector has emergency management and crisis management and business continuity folks, it's not frequent that, you know, this one power company is putting their after action report out on the internet for the other power companies to review and learn lessons from, because there's competitors out there. So a lot of times we don't want to share our best practices or our lessons learned with our competitors. But it's definitely shameful if from the perspective of government, because we're not competing against each other in government. We should be willing and very open to sharing our lessons learned. By keeping this knowledge closely held, whether it be in an after action report or some other document, you know, it's really minimizing the overall value of that final artifact and all the time that was spent putting it together, because we know how long it takes to put together an after action report. Now, there are other domains that have taken that documentation and sharing of knowledge seriously. I think, you know, the NTSB and the Chemical Safety Board are good examples of this, where they've established very deliberate processes to do investigations of incidents that have occurred, but then also dedicate a massive portion of it figuring out how they can best transfer that knowledge to other people who may encounter similar failures in the future. And there have been discussions in the emergency management world about similar concepts that could be developed. The most recent being the National Disaster Safety Board, which had gained some traction in Congress. In our resources page, we'll share a recent opinion piece that was put in to the Hill, kind of describing the sequence of events that have taken place on that bill so far, and, you know, what the need is for something like that to be in our world. We really want to make sure, though, that, you know, while we talk about incidents and exercises being these great examples where there's some sort of an after action report that comes out of the incident, this concept of knowledge management and knowledge transfer should exist across all phases of emergency management. We should be looking at how we can transfer knowledge about how to better apply for grants, how to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of mitigation projects. You know, how can we share knowledge on plan development? You know, all of this stuff should be thought of from the perspective of how can we share this with our colleagues. You know, this is something that is known frequently in other sectors is learning gets truncated at organizational boundaries. You know, we have a real challenge, you know, getting out of our world and sharing that with our partners, our colleagues, and sometimes our competitors. So definitely something that we needed to work better on. Next slide. So this is a great movie. You know, especially in today's market where there's really no good movies anymore. This is a perfect visual, though, of you know, the post-incident analysis process and the after-action report. It's like, you know, you read some of these reports and it's just like a pat on the back kind of a thing. Like, everybody's like, oh man, this whole group did so well, everything went really well. And then you read some of the recommendations that are out of it, and they're just very generic and bland and don't really recognize some of the actual failures that occurred and ways that we can actually get around them moving forward. I asked the question, like, no lessons were shared because no lessons were learned. I mean, is that the reason why we're not seeing this constant sharing of knowledge across our organizations? This is something that is a big problem in emergency management. Next slide. So right now, there are some resources that are out there that exist for the purpose of trying to share knowledge in our world. I think many that have been in emergency management for a little while have probably remembered the old LLIS, Lessons Learned for Information Sharing. And that was definitely set up in deliberate fashion to try and share knowledge across jurisdictions in the emergency management and homeland security space. At one point, LLIS shut down, and the knowledge that was contained in that system was transferred over to the Homeland Security Digital Library, which still exists today. It's part of the Center for Homeland Security and Defense, or Homeland Defense and Security, CHDS, out of the Naval Postgraduate School. And it's a great resource. You can go on there and find documents and resources from years prior to 9/11. I mean, it's such a great repository of information. But the challenge, though, is I think for the majority of the practitioners that are out there, is that it's essentially a large collection of inert knowledge. It's not easy to find specifically what you're looking for from the sense of, this is my problem. I need to find 10 other similarly sized organizations with similar demographics that have also been through this same exact circumstance. That's not the way that it's set up. It's set up as a sort of in the model of a library. So you really need to know what you're looking for. You need to know whether there's, in the case of NPS, they have a librarian that focuses on Homeland Security, so you could leverage that as a resource. But it's not something where it's just quick and intuitive knowledge access that we would hope for in our work. So really what we need to look towards is, okay, in other sectors, they have looked to try and build portals and repositories of information that are easy to contribute to, but also easy to gather information from. The user interface is built in a way that allows you to really focus in on the topics that you need when trying to gather information. So this is something that I think we can gain some knowledge from some other sectors that are out there. Let me give you some examples of this. So first, let's talk about near misses. And near misses are sort of a subcategory of types of incidents that we would try and share knowledge about. Because essentially a near miss is an emergency management where we say, wow, we really lucked out. That's a near miss. And in that circumstance, what we're trying to do is try and share information with our colleagues about what didn't happen to lead to failure. What happened that allowed us to mitigate the impact of whatever that problem was. And there's really no place right now in the emergency management world where near misses are captured and cataloged for easy access. But there are databases and systems that are out there that other sectors have focused in on. I think a good example is the Aviation Safety Reporting System, the Firefighter Near Miss Reporting System. These are great examples of high-risk types of environments that have really focused in on the importance of trying to share these near misses with their partners so that those folks don't find themselves in similar situations, or they can invest in mitigation measures to try and reduce that risk moving forward. The biggest problem in near misses is that these frequently do not meet the threshold that we would write an after action report for. We're not going to go through the whole process that we would do during an incident or during an exercise to figure out, what that near miss involves, what were the contributing factors that led up to that specific event, because nothing bad happened for the most part. Essentially, it was a near miss. So this is a real big problem because these are rarely documented, and they're just stuck in the people's institutional knowledge between their ears, essentially. And so it's not being relayed to the newer generations who may find themselves in a similar scenario. So this is something that we need to improve upon. An organization who has been serious about knowledge management and has worked in a very high risk type of environment is NASA. And so if you go to their office, their chief knowledge officer, they have a really well curated set of resources to help transfer knowledge across their entire organization, but also other organizations doing work in the same space that NASA is, whether it be aviation or space work or even just safety science or anything like that. So this is, I think, one potential model that we could look at in the emergency management space to help serve as that information transfer between jurisdictions and organizations. Next slide. The last example for NASA, I think the real great reason that I think that they can serve as a sort of an exemplar on this topic is that they have been able to build an environment that allows for that transfer of knowledge into policy and guidance and training programs. It's not just sort of that inert knowledge that's sitting in a website somewhere. This example, I think that the real gold standard here is that they've created an interface that is easily accessible and allows for very customizable metadata to be searched to try and find similar cases to what you're specifically dealing with. So the Verica Open Incident Database is a tool that was put together by many tech sector partners, organizations like Netflix and Google and Slack and all the other different types of organizations that are out there providing some sort of a software, internet type of software as a service. And the idea is that they put the written postmortems from these incidents up into this database. But what they've done is they've really carefully cataloged the types of metadata for each of the categories within their report. So if I'm searching for something for this type of specific software, or I'm looking for something specific to this type of server system or what, they can easily target that so you can look at things that are applicable to your organization. What's mostly interesting about this specific example is that these are competitors when you think about it. And yet they're sitting here and they're sharing all this post-incident information with each other for the goal to try and prevent broader impacts to the entire internet infrastructure. So it's disappointing that, as emergency managers, we're for the most part on the same side. I certainly know that there are emergency managers that are in private sector organizations that have, some concerns about sharing information outside of the walls of their business. But in government, we should really be looking to try and share this information as broadly and as widely as possible. And that's something I think we need to do a better job on. Next slide. So I think, we'll go ahead.
No, I think that's a great summary. And I think that, I think the point that both Justin and I, though, want to kind of end the last unit on here is that all of this in itself, doing the postmortems, sharing them, the reports or whatever, that does not actually make change happen. Okay, instead what that does is that directs our group, our agency, our organization to areas that we might not be paying attention to, or we might not be giving the resources or time and energy to that we need to. And what we need to acknowledge is that, yes, if we build continuous improvement into how we work, it's less of a burden, but there is still a cost at every level to the data collection, to the report writing, to the publication. And, if that is what we're putting all our energy and effort into, are the costs incurred outweighed by the benefits? And I would say no, if you take action. And that's really what we want to talk about next, is that all of this needs to lead towards change. And we need to have a balance in the learning phase, the collection and analysis phase, the report writing phase, with the solution development phase, with how we're managing the change. So, currently we're doing these reports, we're doing these reviews, we may be interviewing all these people, we might be doing all this data analysis, trying to decide what was true, which will never happen. And we make an improvement plan, maybe it gets assigned to someone and it goes on a shelf. And in that point, all of that was a huge cost with no outcome and no benefit. And what our better practices are from the other sectors and other disciplines is that we need to focus on contributing factors, not finding absolutes and not coming to agreement on exactly what happened and why it happened. No, there's going to be disagreement, and that's where we need to start from. Focus on those contributing factors. We need to leverage the best practices in continuous improvement, which say those who are closest to the problem are best to solve the problem, which means we have to empower those on the front lines to drive the process improvement. And that we need to be designing our processes based on what our customer values and what our customer needs, not based on all the junk that gets added in, the bureaucracy that gets added into our processes, and just say, well, that's the way we've always done it. Some of the techniques that I personally like to use, and I'm a lean black belt, and it's not karate, but it's basically chopping the crap out of our processes and getting to the best parts of what we're trying to do so we can be as efficient and effective as we can. And one of the techniques we use in lean are called Kaizen events or rapid improvement events. And if we've gone through a post-mortem or even a pre-mortem, so if we go to our pre-mortem example that I gave of we failed to get the mitigation grant. Well, if we identify in that pre-mortem the failure was because our grant application process is so convoluted that each of us all thought there was a different way to do it. And we had that meeting, and I'm like, as a supervisor, I'm like, holy cow, our process is the problem. We have a ridiculous process. Everybody thinks it's different. And I say, all right, we're going to have a rapid improvement event. We're going to bring everybody together. We're going to use a facilitator, and we're going to go through this methodology to actually create a process that's going to work for us. And so Kaizen events or rapid improvement events are great ways to incorporate that kind of blameless culture into making these improvements on, what we really want to get out of our processes. There's a ton of tools in our resources that we're going to share on this, as this was primarily what I was doing in my previous job. But I think the other key part is once you've decided on a solution and you've come up with whatever that solution is, then you have to get everybody to adopt it. And that's really, that's tricky, right? So everybody, wants things to improve, and then everybody hates change. So we're in this paradox of we're trying to continuously improve, yet we're facing this kind of exhaustion from everyone that everything keeps changing. So there's a whole field out there of change managers. There's actually a certification for it. It's a whole profession, and businesses are hiring change managers at a ridiculous rate as we're trying to adapt to what is constant change in our environment. There's different models out there. This is the ADKAR model that Prosecki came up with. If anybody's familiar with John Cotter, he's kind of like the father of change management, has some great books. But the whole point is to understand that because continuous improvement is happening in a system, you actually need to manage that change in order to get people through it so that we can, actually adopt whatever the improvement is we're trying to make. And I really don't feel like we do this at all in emergency management because we've exhausted all of our time, energy, blood, sweat, and tears trying to write a report that by the time we're like, fine, just do whatever, it'll just happen again next time and I'll write it in my next report. But it is gaining traction. So this is the good news. We are gaining traction on getting towards more iterative improvements that are happening in near real time. The RAND Corporation has promoted the concept of interaction reports, which is kind of getting there. There's other groups that are promoting kind of those real-time evaluation, real-time learning. Essentially what they're saying is, okay, let's do after actions in the middle of incidents, again, okay, that's great. We should be iterating as we're going, and we should be doing it deliberately. But if we're really doing it for the point of just documenting historically, that's really not the point. The point is to really move us towards rapid improvement, where we're implementing corrective actions as we go based on a learning culture of, hey, we want to make these improvements. So we did this during COVID. I worked for FEMA as part of the continuous improvement program. I ran the continuous improvement program for FEMA Region 1. During COVID, we implemented a rapid improvement methodology that took us through the 2 years of COVID and led us to do a series of rapid improvement events, leading to a bunch of different changes as each stage of the pandemic evolved. And if anyone would have told you, that's probably the busiest time we ever had, and it's the most we ever did continuous improvement. So I was impressed that if people start seeing results, they're willing to make the time to do continuous improvement in the middle of an incident. There's a bunch of resources that are out there. There's the FEMA IS Continuous Improvement course. And then there's the Continuous Improvement Prep Toolkit site, which I really encourage you to check out, which includes the very newly hot off the press as of November National Continuous Improvement Guidance that FEMA and the Continuous Improvement Program put out. Myself and Justin contributed mostly to chapter 6, which is about process improvement, which if you had to read one chapter, please read that, because that's the point, is to improve our processes. And I'll let Justin talk a little bit about where we've compiled some more of the resources on this bit.ly link down here. Justin, I don't know if you want to cover that.
So on this link that you see at the bottom, and we'll send an email out to all the folks who attended, but also the people who are registered that couldn't attend today with this link. It's a document that we put together that has much of the resources that we put forth in this presentation so that you can do some more deep diving into some of these areas. There's also a lot of templates that we've put together that have been sort of adapted for the emergency management world. I think the other piece of it, though, is it's important is that it's set up as a Google Doc so that you can go in suggestion mode and make recommendations for other documents that we should add there that you may have used in your practice that we want to make sure that other people are aware of. That's the whole point of knowledge management, is to share information. So please be sure to add your own resources in there if you've got them.
All right, so I kind of just close this out here, and Justin, I'll ask you this question. You know, what do you think the future holds for continuous improvement in emergency management?
So it's interesting because when we already did this presentation back in Savannah and asked each other this question, but since Savannah, there has actually been some unbelievable progress made on my topic. So I had mentioned that I think that the future for continuous improvement is that any emergency manager will be able to leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning to capture the things that they've learned throughout incidents and throughout their projects, things like that. It'll all be sort of being documented in the background, put into sort of this database, this repository for our colleagues to be able to easily put in an inquiry to say, hey, this is the issue, what do I do? And that could be for a mitigation grant, but it also could be in the middle of an incident. As you're progressing through an incident, this system is giving you pointers and guides to say, hey, by the way, did you know that the city of Gary, Indiana dealt with this same situation 5 years ago when this happened? So now you as a decision maker can sit there and see some of these other examples of things that you may want to consider as part of your courses of action. Well, since Savannah, there's now ChatGPT, which is that artificial intelligence chat, which is built off of a large language model. And you can see just by going onto that tool that you can ask it questions about piece of information, and within a matter of seconds, it responds back with information that's stored within that knowledge repository that can help you make better decisions. So I said in Savannah that maybe in the next 2 years we would have something like this. I don't know. It's almost seeming like it'll be in a couple months. It's moving pretty quickly. What do you think will be the future of continuous improvement?
Okay, well, I think some other interesting things happened since we left Savannah, and I think, one of them was some controversy about, bringing in other concepts outside of HSEEP into the emergency management profession. But I think what I heard from everyone really was everyone was saying was that, we do agree that continuous improvement needs to be the foundation for emergency management. It's just that uncertainty about exactly how do we go about doing that. And so, as I said in Savannah, and I still really truly believe this, is that I think the future holds us really equipping ourselves as emergency managers with process improvement skill sets and change management skill sets that you would find in any of the other sectors and any of the other disciplines, whether it's, us becoming trained and proficient in those concepts or us hiring process improvement specialists. But I think the other thing that I really do see is emergency management overall moving towards a systems approach to continuous improvement, meaning that we're not just doing it after an exercise. We're not only doing after actions as part of HSEEP. We're doing it as part of everything and as part of all of our work. And I really do think we're headed in that direction. I think we just need to catch up with the tools and guidance and training that's going to enable all of us to, do this effectively. And then, like you said, Justin, share what we've learned.
Sounds good. So I hope that folks who have attended this session have gained an appreciation of some of the smart continuous improvement practices that take place in other industries. But really, at a minimum, what I hope this does, it convinces you to explore this topic further, that now you are familiar with the topic of continuous improvement. Now you know how important it is to emergency management. I mean, ultimately, don't just stop at HSEEP. HSEEP is one tool in the toolbox here for exercises, but think about incidents and think about continuous improvement for your day-to-day operations in preparedness, in mitigation and recovery. Think about how you can commit to continuous improvement across your entire emergency management program. So at this point, we will take questions. If you have a question, type it into the chat box, and then we will see it in, or to type it into the question box in the GoToWebinar, and we'll see it in our chat box here.
I'm not sure if we're getting any questions because I'm not seeing anything, but that could just be my inability to. Okay, someone asked to find Poetti, which I think Justin anticipated that question when he said it out loud. But if you've ever done a THIRA, which is another acronym, a threat hazard identification and risk assessment, it just sets out these standard categories for which we might assess our capabilities. And again, it's plans, organization, which really just means people, staff, training, exercise, and equipment. And what Justin and I did with the resource page, mainly Justin, but what we did with the resource page is we tried to translate all of these concepts from other industries into our emergency management talk, right? Because we have code for everything, right? So I think that's one of the challenges I think that we've seen, and why haven't we more widely adopted like all of the practices that everyone else has across all other industries and even other parts of the government. I think it's just a failure to translate. Like the concepts are very relatable to what we're doing in emergency management. We're just, drowning in emergencies, and someone needs to take the time to translate a postmortem into what we would think of as a hot wash, right? So That's what we're trying to do, is make those connections for everyone. And, we really welcome the questions of, like, how does this actually work? How does this, what would you relate it to as in terms of what we are already doing as a profession? Because I think a lot of times we are doing these things, we're just not using the right language to describe them, and therefore we're kind of missing out on that culture element of continuous improvement. All right, I'm not sure. That was okay. Question 2. Okay, so this is about literally writing the postmortem document. There's a template in there, and it says, when adding to the document, is the info added chronologically to the document or added at the end? I think that definitely is depending on how you set up your postmortem and report. And I don't know if Justin, if you want to talk more about the template, but I think organizing things for people so they can contribute under the predefined sections that are typically in there is helpful, but also thinking of things chronologically as far as the timeline goes is very helpful as well. So Justin,
Yeah, I would say that if people are adding information into the report, if you're doing it asynchronously, ultimately you want people to add their information, their content right into the section that's appropriate for that. And even though you're allowed to sort of kind of do it in a way that is just one person drafting the report and then you ask for feedback, or if you want to just have it sort of as a free-for-all where everybody can go in, it's sort of how much do you trust your team in being able to use like an open Google Doc to put something together. It's still very important that there's one person whose job it is to really clean it up and organize it in the final version. So yeah, I think that the way to do it is you'll see the template. It has sections for a lot of the core areas that we want to try and document as part of the postmortem process. And then you would have folks add their content specifically in there, and then somebody's got to clean it up at the end to make sure that it all works.
Okay, here's a great question about how continuous improvement is what I call the coalition of the willing. And here's a person saying, I work in a county EMA, and maybe the solution holders to most of the problems are not under your authority, right? And I think that's everybody in emergency management, right? So often when we're looking at incidents, but even projects, the solutions, the people that hold the keys to the solutions are not under our authority, and and we have to use influence and form what I like to call the coalition of the willing to get these changes implemented. I think one key way to do that is actually using this approach where we're using it as a learning opportunity, not necessarily a tasking opportunity out front. Because if you think about the very first steps of the after action are, like everybody knows, are leading towards more work being assigned to them, that just kind of like shuts people off immediately. But if you're thinking about the postmortem as really an opportunity to learn and ask questions, which is in its sense a giving scenario, people are giving out information, you basically built this influence by sharing all this information that now people see and feel like they were part of that, like they all got to give something. Now they're willing to say, oh, well, everybody contributed, let me contribute to the solution part of this. So I think that, we have to play on, on what is going to drive people to participate in the process, and getting rid of that fear of blame, but also the fear of having a pile of work is part of why I like this approach a lot better. I think the other thing to do when we do this is we're really demonstrating how, if we're using the different tools like the fishbone diagram or the other visual representations, sometimes people don't want to take on these solutions because they can't see how they're actually going to help. They just are like, how did this arrive on my desk? Like, why do I have to put up a radio tower over here? I don't know, I wasn't there, wasn't my problem, whatever. If we're including people by making this an open process, people can understand how they are part of the solution, and they can actually see the value that's going to occur by them taking action to implement their solution. And I'm not going to say it's that easy, because it isn't. And really, this is why we have up until this point mostly failed, because we know it's hard to get people to make improvements. So we spend all of our time collecting and documenting the problem, when really we need, if I had to divide up my time, I would spend 90% of it on solution development, with working with people. That's how I did spend all my time. And it was not how my colleagues spent their time. I spent my time helping people put solutions into place, because that's the hard part. Documenting it and collecting the information and all that is really important, and it's great. But the people side of getting people to take on solutions, it's very hard in emergency management, because we're not a business. We can't say, well, this solution is going to make us money, so therefore it will happen, or you won't work here anymore. We don't have that luxury. And so we have to very much invest in bringing people along and making them see how valuable they are to putting a solution in place. And that might be the last question we have. So Justin, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, just so this doesn't really help the person, because they mentioned that they're from a county emergency management agency, but I did want to mention, if you're in an environment like you're a healthcare emergency manager working for a healthcare system, or maybe even in higher education, you're a campus emergency manager, one source to get support for this type of work is you likely have somebody doing quality improvement or lean work in your organization.
Yep.
They will be all on board with this. And so that is another source of support for this type of initiative, and perhaps even expertise to help with this. I honestly, it doesn't help with the government folks, where this has not really gotten this strong support, but just be aware that that does exist in a lot of different sectors.
Yeah, there's a great book called Influence Without Authority. I don't remember who wrote it, but it's about basically what do you do when you're in whoever this questionnaires shoes, and it's happening to a lot of us. But I think Justin's right. Look for your allies. And the other thing I always try to do when I'm starting is I just start with whoever says yes, because at least a problem solved is better than fighting the 10 people who are absolutely not going to help. Fine, then I'll work with the one person who is. And then in the end, we use a little bit of what I like to call peer pressure, and like, well, you're the odd person out, you're not helping anymore. So not that I'm blaming them, but we just use a little bit of other tactics to get people to come along. But just, I think the key here is starting where you can. And someone, left a comment that, their fear is that people are going to see this as too hard. And I think that's why we don't tackle problems in the system, because they are like super hard. And even if you come up with a solution, there's a good chance that it's actually not the right solution, because of all the things we just described. It's really hard to nail down all those contributing factors. But I think that the private sector tells us that, it's better to try and fail, right, than not to try at all. And I think that's our message here, that it's not that it's so hard we can't do it. It's just that we need to pull together as a group and put together those tools and resources so that we can take those steps towards, really having a robust continuous improvement culture in emergency management.
So thanks everybody for attending our session today. Again, I would definitely check out the resources link that we provided, has further information, and certainly feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions. Thanks again.
Thanks everyone, and happy holidays.